Welcome to the Hat Tip Podcast. My name is Jonathan Stern, and my goal is to share the most outstanding blog posts and essays ever written. I want to start with Drew Dickson's Stay in the Game. It's a story he wrote in 2019 about how his son Max overcame his demons and found the good path. It's easily one of the most moving pieces I've ever read. Drew is the chief investment officer at Albert Bridge, so he often writes about financial stuff. Thank you, Drew, for allowing me to read this magical essay and share it with the world. And I speak for all of those who love this essay. Thank you for making the departure from your typical fare and writing a more personal piece. This is Stay in the Game by Drew Dickson. This is going to be an uncharacteristic departure for me. The story is deeply personal for our family and for our oldest son in particular. But it's a story he's letting me tell because it's a story he wants people to hear. My son Max was born in Detroit in 1997. He spent the next summer in Hong Kong when I was interning at Fidelity Investments and moved to London before he was 2 when I accepted an offer to work for Fido there full-time. He was an amazing child and became an amazing young man. But he had his demons. And just before he turned 16 years old, those demons arrived with a vengeance. I'll spare you the details, but for the next 3 years, he went through a personal hell. Imagine all the things you don't want to have happen to your teenager. They happened to him. For 3 years, my wife and I would wait on our front stoop until 5 a.m. in the shadow of the Albert Bridge, hoping that he would come home. On those nights that he didn't, we would call the hospitals and call the police. And sometimes the police would call us. There are many avenues that parents can take in these situations, and we were lucky that we could afford to just about try them all. But none of them helped. The change in schools didn't help. The psychologists didn't help. The wilderness therapy didn't help. Our closest friends and extended family all waded in too, but nothing helped. Max didn't want to be here. He didn't feel a sense of belonging anywhere. His self-esteem was non-existent. The anxiety was paralyzing. He often contemplated ending it all. And only the thought of the impact on his 3 younger siblings prevented him from doing so. It was a living hell for Max, and honestly, it was a living hell for us too. There was nothing we could do about it. The most difficult thing for my wife and I to accept was that only Max could make the choices. It wasn't up to us. We couldn't save him. It was up to him if he was going to live or going to die. As one of my best friends told me at the time, only Max could choose to live. Just over 2 years ago, he realized that the scene in London was poisonous for him, and he asked if he could head out. He'd asked before, and we'd let him go to far-flung destinations, but the grass wasn't greener in any of them. It rarely is. So we didn't expect anything to come of it this time, but told him that we'd pay for the flight because he really did need to get out of London, and there was almost no way things could get worse. He chose a destination a lot of rudderless kids like to visit. It might as well have been Goa, Tulum, Koh Tao, or Maui, but he chose Costa Rica. A friend of his, a good guy, was backpacking there and invited him to come. I told Max we'd cover the first week, but if he wanted to stay longer, he had to get a job and support himself. We truly didn't know what to expect, but it felt like a last shot for him. He loved that first week there and indeed got a job working at one of the hostels in exchange for room and board. But after the honeymoon was over, and eventually the honeymoon is always over, reality set in. His anxiety set in, and his depression set in. Things did get worse. At the darkest point, he almost called it, and there was nothing we could do about it. Even if we weren't 5,000 miles away, there was nothing we could do about it. But for some reason, he decided not to. Max decided to stay in the game. We later learned the reason. He'd found an 8-week-old puppy roaming the streets of Santa Teresa. The dog had been abused, was eating scraps from trash heaps, and was terrified of people. But Max and the dog, which he named Chica, connected with each other. Max and Chica became inseparable. Max, who by then was 19 years old, started to realize he had something to offer. Chica needed help, and Max was there to provide it. Max started doing adult things like earning and saving money so that he could take Chica to the vet for checkups and vaccinations. And Chica started getting healthy. And Max started getting healthy. I could hear it in his voice when he would call. There was an excitement about life and the future that I hadn't heard since he was 14 years old. He was starting to get his groove back. On one of those phone calls, he said to me, "Dad, I think I'm ready to leave Costa Rica." Then he continued, "And while I'll miss you guys, I don't think I should come back to London. I want to go somewhere where I won't be tempted by my old habits, but where I can feel at home and restart everything," he said. "Somewhere like Georgia or Indiana." He said Georgia or Indiana because he was vaguely familiar with both. I grew up in Indiana and then moved to Atlanta, where I lived for several years and ultimately met my wife, Max's mom. I told him that either Georgia or Indiana would be a wonderful idea and that there were great people in both places. I mentioned that I would be comfortable knowing that my old buddies in the ATL would be around just in case he needed a backstop, and that back in Indiana, he'd of course have his grandparents and uncle there for support as well. So he chose Indianapolis. My wife and our other kids flew over to help get him settled into a new apartment downtown, and they got to meet Chica. And before we knew it, Max was working a full-time job and not doing any of the bad stuff he used to do. He still had his demons. These kids always have them. Heck, we all have them. We just learned to manage them. And things were by no means perfect yet, but he could work through the anxiety and work through the depression because he had responsibilities now. He had Chica. On his own in Costa Rica, Max had figured out how to get Chica into the U.S. and convinced someone at American Airlines to let her fly on his lap because they wouldn't let dogs fly in the hold due to the heat. Thereafter, he and Chica settled into their little apartment downtown near the White River Canal, and each of them began their new life together. Max had saved Chica, and Chica had saved Max. One afternoon, 3 months later, when Max was walking Chica, she saw something she hadn't seen in Costa Rica. It was a squirrel. And before Max could stop her, Chica chased that squirrel straight out onto Indiana Avenue, right in front of a speeding car. The car ran over Chica. My son screamed. In that brief moment, everything that Max had worked for, everything he had overcome, everything that he was living for was gone. But the blow didn't kill the dog. The driver that hit her sped off and left Chica half dead and crying in the road. But the next car did stop. It was a young black kid who saw a young white kid on his knees in the middle of downtown Indianapolis. His name was Kenny. He opened his door, got out of his car, walked up to my son and said, "Hey, I got you." He then walked Max out to the middle of Indiana Avenue, and they picked up a bloody Chica and loaded her into Kenny's car. Turns out that Kenny had just moved to Indiana and had grown up down in Georgia. He'd been traveling around a bit and had recently lost his job up north. He subsequently found an offer for a temporary position down in Indianapolis and had just started work there. He was apprenticing at his new shop and was hoping to be made a permanent employee. Kenny was just 21. But none of that mattered to Kenny at the moment. What mattered to Kenny was Chica and my son Max. So Kenny looked up a vet clinic on his phone and took Max and Chica there. The vet said that without surgery, Chica would die. But the vet wasn't a surgeon and they needed to go somewhere else. Luckily, Kenny had stayed. Kenny was there by Max's side like a big brother. And this wonderful young man then took Max and Chica to another vet, one that could do the surgery. The vet did the surgery. It worked. Chica lived. Her pelvis was broken, but over the next 6 months, Max nursed her back to health. Without Kenny, none of this would have happened. Kenny even stayed in touch with Max afterwards. He would text and see how Chica was doing and how Max was doing. This last Thanksgiving, about 1 year since the accident, Kenny even got some tickets to see the Colts play and asked Max if he would like to come, and then took him out to dinner afterwards. Max is doing great now. He's been working full-time, got super healthy, started running marathons, and is now on the good path. These were his choices. They had to be. And he did it. But it almost didn't turn out this way. Kenny made sure he stayed on that path. This guy Kenny, I want to reach out and give him the biggest hug he ever got. I want to tell him that he is special. I want to thank him for saving Chica's life. I want to thank him for saving my son's. Oh, and as a follow-up, we got some news about Kenny this past week. It's some really good news. Kenny not only got that job offer, he just got a nice long contract along with it. Kenny Moore from Valdosta, Georgia, just signed a contract with the Indianapolis Colts to be the highest paid slot cornerback in the NFL, in a deal that is going to pay him at least $30 million over the next 4 years. Good things happen to good people. Kenny stayed in the game too.